Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel Startup and Corporate Collaboration for the DeepTech Ecosystem. And we have with us Mr. Rajiv Mathew, who's Head Corporate Innovation and Market Connect for Asia Pacific and Japan, Oracle for Startups. We have with us Mr. Pankaj Mitra, who's Director of Investments and Acquisitions for CISCO, and Mr. Subinder Khurana, who's founder and former lead mentor for NASSCOM DeepTech Club. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome to the panel.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here.
Hello. Thank you.
Pankaj, let's start with you. Now, when we talk about startup and a corporate collaboration, we always look towards corporate as to how they can integrate a startup in its operation. Give us a little bit of insight into how you have done it and what success it has yielded for you.
Yeah, sure thing. So CISCO has been an active investor and acquirer of startups for the past 30 years. And so we have a very deep standing, long engagement with the startup ecosystem. I think it comes down to, what are the strengths of each, a corporate and a startup, to make a win-win scenario. So if you look at the corporate, right, the strengths are the resources that it has, the customer relationships that it has established, the technology platforms that it has developed over the years, right? And if you look at a startup, the strengths are just the inherent ability to take risks, to pivot, to find scalable business models, to scale success or to stop failure, as the case may be, very fast. And so when you combine these two together, it makes for a very interesting proposition. So if a startup can align to what a corporate's customers are looking for in terms of them gaining a competitive advantage or gaining access to a new technology, I think it could be a marriage made in heaven. So that's really, I think, the core of the startup and corporate collaboration, which is just making sure that we draw from the strengths of each to make it a good synergistic collaboration.
Thank you. Rajiv, your view on it.
Yeah, so, I would just try to expand on what Pankaj just mentioned. So, the integration of a startup and a corporate is, the approaches are varied, and it's varied because there are different objectives that is followed while this integration is being pursued. So some of the scenarios could be that is a corporate looking at a startup as a competitor, right? I mean, if it is a potential competitor, then, what follows an integration, whether it is, is it an acquire, and whether they are acquiring the resources within that company, the ideas, but then dissolving the entity itself. Is the scenario about looking at a startup which is complementing, having very similar offerings like what this corporate has, and therefore would they want to, maintain the same product line because this brand is very visible, but then integrate the backend, which is more of the operations, the cost optimizations, the networks, and so on. Would they want to look at a startup which is something about a very new disruptive idea, and therefore would they want to extend their product portfolio? Or is it just that, the corporate sees a startup as a co-development partner, and they would like to just fund these startups and help them to develop a product, constantly validate that, and achieve a product market fit. So these are different scenarios by which those are different scenarios which they pursue when they are looking at an integration with a startup. Now how can you actually ensure that the integration is successful? I mean, there are probably a couple of points to touch here, which is that, while you're scouting for a startup and you start negotiations, you have early conversations on what are the exclusions and what is the vision that the integration intends to achieve. And once you have that, ready a plan, make like a 100-day plan or a 30, 60, 90-day plan saying that, hey, this is how the integration would roll out, and set up joint integration teams. The reason being that different scenarios have different touch points. It could be HR related, it could be operations related, it could be R&D related, and so on. So have those joint integration teams constantly review this plan over a period of 100 days and see if those objectives are being fulfilled. Nominate somebody, a champion within the organization who has a presence in the board, who can interface with the startups and say that, hey, if there are issues, I am the one who is to sort it out, right? And keep it very informal. Have these informal and formal touch points on and off, so that you constantly are able to help support the startup in terms of the integration. And mostly when you always engage with a startup, it's a culture that stands out, because the one is a behemoth and the other one is an agile entity which has a unique culture, and you don't want to touch that. So retain the culture, bring on board the people, and if there are figureheads, then negotiate settlement and leaving them go, so that there is no resistance or passivity that comes in while the integration is done. So this is one way to look at the why integration needs to be pursued, and the how integration needs to be rolled out. So that's my view.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you. Subinder, you have a unique view of the startups as well, because you have had a hand in mentoring them and devising an entire formula for it. What is the importance of such collaboration, and what will it come to mean if we have to build a successful deep tech ecosystem in India?
So if I go back to first principles, and I'm going to probably repeat a lot of the points that Pankaj and Rajiv made, but probably put a different lens on it. If you go back to first principles, a startup is an experiment discovering valuable, repeatable innovation or business model, whereas an enterprise is executing well understood business model, and therefore a large company and any enterprise has to have a lot of other pieces around, right? Risk mitigation, scale up, planning, all of those things. So mistakes are a big are to be avoided in an enterprise, whereas a startup is really, you just sandbox, take a lot of risk, right, and discover a new innovation, new business model. And if you go with that lens, then it becomes clear, right, that the startup basically has to bring in that innovation and either fail fast or succeed. And when it succeeds, then it needs the enterprise platform to scale, right? And vice versa for the enterprise. This is a great way to sandbox and manage risk, so that even if there's failure, it's a very well contained failure, right? And that kind of lays out why and how this needs to work well, right? So the importance of such a collaboration is, this is the only way where we can take innovations and scale them reliably, right? We have to make sure first we experiment with a lot of innovations, make a lot of rapid mistakes with a finite risk associated with them. And once they start to work, then we bring in the management, the full platform, the scale and relationships of an enterprise to work on them, right? And if you go in with that perspective, that's the best way to make sure that we're able to get the innovations, create a win-win formula, right? And at the same time, both we're able to reward the entrepreneurs who are are able to come up with the innovations, and reward the enterprises who help them scale those innovations well, right? The part so what not to do is understanding that the startup is an experiment, not a scale platform. The mistake would be to try to bring in the systems of an enterprise into a startup. That's the number one mistake I see, whether it's through mentors, whether it's through innovation programs, is, larger companies, the successful people have learned to manage large businesses in a predictable, scalable way, right? The same formula does not work in a startup, where the end goal is not really to create scale. The end goal is to create a new innovation and manage the downside risk of that innovation. So if we try to take the systems of a large company and try to impose them on a startup, right, or to look at what's missing over there and try to fill in the gaps, that would be the mistake. I think what the enterprise needs to do is provide that help, provide that platform, but let the startup do what it does well, which is to innovate. Right.
Thank you, Subinder. Yes, you wanted to add something else.
So if you avoid that formula, then I think this marriage works really. So thank you.
Thank you, Subinder. That's a fantastic point. And the gentleman also threw light on how a successful incubation program looks like. But I'll flip the question a little bit, Rajiv. What are the obvious red flags that you would back off from?
When it comes to incubator?
Yes. And
Okay.
also investing your time in a startup in that case.
Right. So see, when it comes to incubators, I mean, if you define what it takes to succeed, and you flip it around, you actually get what fails incubators. And largely, if you look at it, startups generally have a 90% failure rates, and incubators as such is a test bed for ideas. And one of the reasons why incubators succeed is because one is that they have a great network and they have a great support system which involves the business angels, the venture capitalists, the mentors. Mentors are so important, the industry mentors. They have a co-working space which comes along with business advisors and so on. But then, one is the unpredictability of, reducing the risk for an entrepreneur. And the best way to say this would be that, if you want a startup to succeed, then reduce the risk for the entrepreneur, the personal as well as the financial risk. Now, you want to, and also if you want this to succeed, then, you ensure that, it has a tie-up with the university or with R&D of a corporate. Now, which means that, you have a steady access of funds, you have mentor access, you have somebody who's constantly helping validate the business roadmap or the product roadmap for the startup, and also the product, the product fit or the market. Now, these are the ways that you ensure that, you bring success to an incubator or increase success for an incubator. Alliances also works to a very large extent. Alliances with incubators and accelerators in other regions, wherein a product market fit might be right in a different market. You might develop something that could be good for a different market. You have accelerators from where the startups would graduate into. So I would say that this is an ideal ecosystem setting up for success. And without some of these, you are setting for failure as well. Yeah, you're on mute, Avash.
Yeah. Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you for that insight. Pankaj, your take on it?
So, Vaishnavi, maybe I'll take a step back and just talk about what the different engagement models are. And then the red flags will probably differ according to the engagement model that the startup and the corporate has, right? So at CISCO, what we have is, at the incubation level, we have CISCO Launchpad, which is an accelerator. We don't take equity. We've accelerated about 54 startups now through 7 cohorts. And that's really early stage startups providing mentorship on sales, on technology. And then we have CISCO Investments, where we invest into startups. And it's not just capital, but we also have a very robust portfolio development team. We're introducing the startups to our sales channels, basically our $50 billion go-to-market machine, right? Whether it's sales folks, our partner folks, showcase them in events, etc. And then we have acquisitions, where it's the deepest form of collaboration that can happen, where the startup becomes part of CISCO, right? I think the first red flag is to really figure out which engagement model is right for the startup at their journey and the corporate's journey. So you don't want to obviously put a mature startup in an incubator. Usually a corporate investing in a very early stage startup leads to mismatched expectations, as Subinder was pointing out, right? And for an acquisition, that culture fit that Rajiv pointed out becomes very important, in addition to the alignment of the goals, right? So I think that's the first thing that needs to happen. And I think once that works, then in the engagement model, I think metrics are important to track the success. whether it be incubation, so number of doors opened, and we track all of this. Same thing with investments, number of conferences, number of doors opened, number of, the amount of business that we're driving for the startups, we measure all of that. And then for acquisitions, we actually have a pretty formal process where we make sure that whatever projections or plan we were thinking of during the time of acquisition, we have a way to track it, to course correct as needed, etc. And if some of these metrics are not in place and the governance mechanism is not in place, I think that's a big red flag. So especially for a corporate, and this is what corporates are good at, right? Making things more structured, programmatic. And I think it's kind of on the onus of the corporate to make sure that programmatic approach is in place so that the failures are minimized.
Noted, Pankaj, and thank you for elaborating on the metrics point. That was a good point. Now, how do we mentor startups to scale and expand into other geographies as well? Because the deep tech appetite is relatively a little higher at this moment in other parts of the world, say in the West, or Europe is still budding. In Israel, we have seen a successful ecosystem. How do we then mentor? And your expertise is also storytelling and brand building. How does it come together in a mentorship aspect for startups?
Okay, that's actually a topic very close to my heart. And I see a lot of mentors make a very fundamental mistake because, so what is the role of a mentor in a startup? Is it to tell the startup what to do? Absolutely not. I think most mentors see their role as, here's somebody who's junior to me and I need to tell them what to do. No. The role of a mentor is to help the startup avoid mistakes, what not to do, right? And avoid expensive mistakes. Mistakes they should be making, but help them avoid expensive mistakes, which means that let them, they have to innovate, right? They have to break some rules. So if you're going to just tell them, look, here are the rules of how things work in our industry, well, you don't have a startup anymore. The startup by definition has to break rules. So your job as a mentor becomes show them that breaking those rules does not result in expensive mistakes. So help them, limit the bad impact, or if it's such an obvious mistake, help them avoid some really blatant mistakes where you've seen 3 failures in the recent past trying to do that, right? But if they're trying something new, which is uncharted, absolutely, we should encourage them. Just make sure that they don't fall to their death doing that. Give them a safety net. So that's one. And how do we do that? Don't give answers, help them ask the right questions. Don't give answers, help them ask the right questions, because they have to discover the answer for themselves. Just make sure that they are not, or at least make sure that they're asking the questions, because a lot of entrepreneurs don't even ask the question. That's where the mistake comes. Second thing is, don't share rules, share stories, which means you say, look, this is what I saw in this market. This is what I saw that company do, right? Here's where we tried something and this worked or didn't work. Those stories are very helpful because those stories become guides on, something that worked. Can I take a lesson and apply it? The lesson has to be learned and applied by the entrepreneur. You can't tell them this is the lesson, the moral of the story, but the story itself becomes helpful in creating new ideas in their mind, experiments that they can try out, right? And of course, you need to share the resources. You need to share, help them find the right people to get expertise. If they're looking for specific answers to specific questions, help them find those answers. Provide them directly or help them find somebody who can answer those questions. And another very big role of a mentor is to provide emotional support. An entrepreneur's journey is so lonely and so scary at times. They will have days when it'll look like the end of the world, right? They just need somebody who says, look, I'm here, I'm willing to listen to you. Look, I'm here and you can, that there will be good days and there will be bad days, right? And that emotional support very often is the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful journey for an entrepreneur. So it's really just those 3 things. help them ask the right questions, not the answers, share stories, not rules, and provide emotional support, right? Just sometimes just sit and listen. I mean, I still remember, I spent a lot of time with Jaspreet, the founder of Yuva at the early days of his journey. And very often, he would come, just sit, talk for 2 hours. And at the end of it, say, oh, this was such a wonderful experience. And I'd say, I didn't tell you a single thing, right? But it just helps them to talk it through, right? It clears it up in their minds. And just have a sympathetic listener who also understands it means a word to entrepreneurs. Okay, so that's the difference between a mentor and what I see as sometimes a mistake that a lot of mentors make.
Thank you, Subinder. Thank you for those insights. Rajiv and Pankaj, I'll direct a question to you. Does your role also involve sometimes stepping into the shoes of a mentor, and how do you then help the startup scale and grow beyond the geographies that they were conceptualized in?
Yeah. Yes, in fact, yes, my role draws upon role of mentor as well sometimes. And I was just listening to what Subinder was saying, asking the right questions and helping them to find the answers, and also in terms of emotional support. And I've been passionate about the startup ecosystem, and I've spent a lot of time sitting with these startups and helping them in the journey. And when it comes to mentoring, I think the first two questions that you will ask these startups is, hey, why do you want to scale and go to a different geography? The thought is that once they answer the why, your how and when and where will automatically come into place. So that begins the story of, okay, I mean, whether they have the right thought when it comes to expanding overseas or into other markets. And then we look at are they ready for other markets? Are they ready in terms of their product maturity? Are they ready in terms of the technology readiness? And do they have a flavor that fits into a particular market? Now, once that is being ascertained, that is when we at Oracle for Startups have a definite pathway for startups to go from let's say India to go and pitch in North America or to other markets as well. So we have that pathway, and of course, mentoring is the first line of that conversation on where they're beginning to scale. So a lot of able to relate a lot with what Subinder was saying and continue there. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you. Pankaj, your view on it.
So I think Subinder and Rajiv put it very well on the mentorship side, to ask the right questions. And really for me, again, as a mentor, it's just drawing upon my personal experiences, right? Whether they are professional experiences, personal experiences, to become a sounding board, to hear the founders out and to provide whatever help you can. And most of the times you don't even know if you're helping or not, right? But you kind of just do the best you can and draw from your own personal experiences, right? Nobody wants to hear another canned story of a successful startup or anything like that. I'll touch upon the geographical expansion, because that is a topic which is very near and dear to our hearts. We are a global company. Most of our revenue is from the US, and it's a very significant amount of revenue. And I think we take a very structured approach to helping our startups expand in geographies outside of India. Those could be in many ways, right? It could be from a product perspective or a technology perspective, talking to the right people who have just seen much more of the world. And our view is a little colored maybe, or a little specific, because this is all through the lens of enterprise tech, right? So that's what we live and breathe all day long. That's our focus area: enterprise tech, deep tech. Arguably the market for that is really outside of India for the most part. Hopefully it changes. India picks up over the next few years, but still the market today is outside of India. And I think that talking to the right people who have just seen more of enterprise tech outside of India becomes very important. If all your customers, if they are outside of India, then having a channel to some of those customers becomes very important, because a small startup based out of India, it can be a real struggle to actually penetrate the US, especially in a competitive category. So that's something that we pay a lot of emphasis on. And as I said, our portfolio development team, which is a very specific function within our CISCO investments team, does this all day long, which is connect founders with our sales channel, showcase them in our events in the US. We have like a small startup village in some of our biggest events like CISCO Live, where we just showcase like 16 to 20 of our portfolio companies. And there are people walking by, from executives of our customers to partners to even CISCO executives, who the portfolio companies get exposed to. And we've just seen that alone driving just a ton of leads for the companies, a ton of visibility. So I think small things like that from a cross-border perspective can reap very large dividends. And so that's something that definitely we focus on.
Thank you, Pankaj. That was interesting. And yes, as you mentioned, hopefully things change and India becomes the deep tech destination, and all the stakeholders come together of the ecosystem to make that happen. And thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for taking time out and discussing about how the collaboration can work between startup and corporate, and what would it end up meaning for the ecosystem in general as well. Thank you.
Thank you.